Thank you very much, Mike, for organizing the possibility of this talk with the 1904 World's Fair Society. It's particularly a nice time to do it here at the beginning of 2026, when I know in the springtime this society will be celebrating 40 years of educating about the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, preserving and protecting and restoring artifacts from the World's Fair. So I'm happy to be here as you kick off this 40th anniversary celebration. This little piece of the World's Fair came to me out of nowhere and unexpectedly. I walked into a small antique store in Park Hills, Missouri in May of 2025, Raggedy Annie's. I was in that store looking for memorabilia about Flat River Junior College, which was founded in 1922, and its successor, Mineral Area College, which was organized in 1965. It's where I currently serve as coordinator in the History and Poli-Sci department and teach history and world religions. I had heard that in the back of this store, in a space the owner, Gene and Annette Fritchie, called Cities Museum, there was memorabilia about the college going back to 1922 and about the four towns that organized one town called Park Hills in 1994. When I finished looking things over at the back of the store, and it was quite an impressive collection, the owner of the store, Mr. Fritchie, pointed to the front of the store and said, "I have two bathtubs from the 1904 World's Fair." Now, when I had walked into the store, I had not noticed those shiny objects in the front window. Now I walked from the back of the store to the front of the store, and I was able to see that indeed there were two very shiny objects that looked like bathtubs at the front of this store. One of them had a label, 1904 World's Fair exhibit, Gustav Lind, a bathtub. The other one had bubbles and a yellow rubber ducky with the idea that these were bathtubs. I am by nature a skeptical person, and I'm also a curious person. So I went home directly, took a seat at my computer, and started Googling all the combinations of the information that was provided on that little note card. I came across two articles. The first was from 2017 in St. Louis Magazine, a brief reference to the fact that Antiques Roadshow was in St. Louis and that these two bathtubs were brought there for the experts to take a look at. And the other one was from 2019 when these two items were on display at the Farmington Public Library, and the local paper, the Daily Journal, did a story about the meeting with Antiques Roadshow 2 years prior. Now, the headline of that story is overstated. The Antiques Roadshow experts did not solve the tub mystery. What they were able to do was explain that the maker's mark that had been taken to be an E or a C was actually a G. They also were able to determine that that G stood for Gustaf, and they were able to determine that Gustav Lind had indeed exhibited at the fair. What they were not able to ascertain with any certainty was any additional information about Gustav Lind himself. They were still referring to these items as bathtubs, and there was no evidence that these two tubs were at the World's Fair. No photographic evidence was uncovered, and no written evidence was uncovered. The man standing in the photo on the right at the top, on the left side of the photo, is Denzel Jennings, and he is the person who found both of these bathtubs more or less hidden from view by nature, trying to take them back. And he found them south of the Forest Park Fairgrounds, where the World's Fair was held, about a total of 83 miles by highway. If you go down 44 and 270, 55, 67, eventually you'll get off on a two-lane country road, H Highway, and then at some point along H Highway south of Farmington, Missouri, you make a left onto a gravel road that's nearly 2 miles from H Highway down to that area that is in the bend of the St. Francis River that you can see there in the photo on the left. And you can see Shadow Wood, which is the gravel road, coming in from Highway H, some distance even off the screen here. And at the end of that highway, you would find this piece of property. This is after the Jennings family had recovered the pasture lands, some of which were overgrown when they purchased it in 1973. They'd also restored the home. These two tubs were found on the back side of the home, between the home and the tree line, which is where the St. Francis River is. When I talk about the Jennings, I'm referring to Denzel Jennings and Joanne Jennings. They were born in 1931 Kansas and 1933 Oklahoma. They married in 1950 Oklahoma when she was 16 and he was 18. They purchased that piece of property, about 300 acres total, in March of 1973. Everything came with the home, everything conveyed with the home, all of the exterior buildings, all of the interior of the home came with it to the Jennings because they purchased it from a widow who had no children, had outlived her husband by 15 years. He, in fact, had died on that property. At some point, either in the summer of 73 or 74 or 75, there are different dates that are given over time. Mr. Jennings is asked by Mrs. Jennings to clear off a particular area on the actual lawn space of the property. It's been grown up with weeds and the leaves of many falls and debris. He goes out to clean that area up, and at some point his metal shovel hits metal. So he begins looking around and he uncovers one of these bathtubs. He continues to look in that area and he uncovers a second, a twin bathtub, a near identical twin, but not quite. These photos were taken at that time. You will see that these had started to sink into the ground in some places up to 1 foot. Someone had painted them white, and the interior liners, which were tin, had actually been almost completely eaten away by rust. The infrastructure, the skeletal infrastructure, also was considerably weak. In 1981, the Jennings had these two items restored by Lloyd Irvin and Stan Winkler at Irvin's Metalsmiths in Cape Girardeau. And these are some photographs from that restoration. It included replacing a steel liner that was necessary to hold up the actual side panels. Also included, of course, removing all of the white paint from the exterior. And then the two interior tin liners had to be completely replaced because they had rusted away so thoroughly. The Jennings also purchased, at some point after this time period, a very well-known historic home in Farmington. It's called the McCormick House. It was built in the 1870s. And they placed inside that home one of the restored tubs. You can see it's there with the basin and the pitcher, with the idea that it's a bathtub, and you might be also washing your hands there at the basin and pitcher, so it was an appropriate place. Mrs. Jennings worked very hard in restoring this property and in getting it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Mrs. Jennings died in 2003. In 2012, Mr. Jennings sold the McCormick House to Melissa and Bruce Workman. Along with that purchase came the one bathtub. The following year, Melissa and Bruce Workman took that bathtub to St. Louis Science Center, where PBS 9 was doing a trash or treasure event. So immediately upon acquiring this item, Melissa and Bruce Workman are trying to learn more, trying to discover more. And in fact, at that event, it came through the World's Fair Society representatives for a brief period. But keep in mind, this was before everyone had digitized everything and everything was available on the internet. And so they were not able to say, yes, this is from the World's Fair. After about 9 years of ownership, the Workmans opted to sell their tub to Mr. Fritchie. Here's his post at Raggedy Annie's Antiques in October of 2021, announcing that one of these World's Fair tubs was now at Raggedy Annie's in Park Hills and inviting everybody to come see the exquisite art that was now on display. The following year, Mr. Jennings, at age 90, passed away. He wanted to have some control over what became of the tub that he still had in his possession, that he had had in his possession now for nearly 50 years. He wanted the two tubs to be back together again the way they were when he found them. He didn't want it being part of the estate sale that would follow his death. So with the help of the Workmans, he arranged to have that tub sold also to the Fritchies. This is the announcement that Gene Fritchie placed at Raggedy Annie's and also here at the 1904 World's Fair Society Facebook page, announcing that the two tubs were together again. They were displayed at his shop in Park Hills, and anybody could come and see them at any point. So this is about what I knew after doing just a little bit of research. Then I decided I needed to take a deeper look into the life of Gustav Lind to see what he actually had exhibited at the fair, if it could be found. Were there documents dating back to 1904 that would provide written print language that would be definitive proof that Mr. Lind had items at the fair, including these bathtubs? The first thing I stumbled upon was this about 600-page book. It was the official catalog put out by the German exhibits at the fair, done for the World's Fair, one edition in German, this edition in English. I immediately turned to the back, and indeed I found Gustav Lind's name mentioned in the index. I don't know that I'm pronouncing the word Nachfolger correctly. I didn't know what it meant at the time. I've subsequently learned that it means that person or that workshop are being represented by someone else now. Either the original owner, in this case Gustav Lind, had sold it, retired, or possibly died, and now his successors are taking responsibility for what's left in the workshop and for the workshop going forward. I immediately turned to pages 443 and 457, and I found both entries there for Mr. Lind. You'll notice there on the left, in the court of honor, 2 bronze flower stands filled out with wrought figures, 2 large lions' heads in bronze, hygienic bath, pillars, and gates in bronze. And on the right, bronze pillars and bronze railings in the bath exhibition. Now, if it hadn't been the case for 50 years that everyone said these are bathtubs, it's possible that the description 2 bronze flower stands filled out with wrought figures might have gotten my attention. But when I think of bronze flower stands, I'm thinking of tall vertical objects, not short, wide objects. And also, both times I read this initially, that word figures in my brain was translated into flowers. So I was looking for 2 bronze flower stands filled out with wrought flowers instead of wrought figures. Even now, I have to think about the word figures to not say the word flowers. So I dismissed that. It doesn't even, in fact, raise any radar bell for me. I noticed the word bath mentioned in both instances, so I'm thinking perhaps there was a failure to mention the bathtubs. Perhaps they arrived late. Perhaps they forgot to put them here. Perhaps they came to the fair to be sold, not to be exhibited. So I'm still thinking at this point that we are talking about actual bathtubs that had been used on the lawn of this farmhouse south of Farmington, 80 somewhat miles south of the World's Fair, and that they simply had not been mentioned in that first catalog. But then I stumbled across the second catalog. This is the descriptive catalog of the German arts and crafts. This was also published by the German exhibitors, and this one was printed up when these items were already at the World's Fair. And you will notice there on the right, you can see these wrought figures in what I now know is a flower stand. The word jardinière is mentioned at the bottom. I didn't know what the word was, looked it up, definition, decorative flower stand, flower pot. I immediately know that in looking for bathtubs or looking for tubs, we had been looking in the wrong direction. We had been searching for the wrong word. Everyone, from the time they were found until this moment, had thought they were bathtubs. And that was part of the hindrance of actually finding proof that these were indeed at the World's Fair. You'll also notice below the jardinière or the planter, below is a lion's head, also made of bronze. Both of these objects were designed by Bruno Moring. He was the architect. He was also the architect of the German Court of Honor. He was also the chief architect of all German exhibits at the 1904 World's Fair. And then you'll notice at the bottom they're highlighted by Gustav Lind, metal sculptor, Berlin. Mr. Moring and Mr. Lind worked together often on many projects over many years. Here's another photograph from that same descriptive catalog. This is an American eagle, about 6.5 feet tall, about 2,500 pounds. It was also created for the German exhibit. It is standing guard at the elevated area that is the German Court of Honor at the Palace of Varied Industries on the grounds of the World's Fair. And you can see there with the arrow at the right, one of the planters. Just below that is the lion's head. And you have the identical setup on the other side of the eagle. Here's a better photo from the Missouri Historical Society collection. It's very crisp and clear, and you can see there quite easily the planter, about 5 to 6 feet off the ground, and then the lion's head, both having been done by the metal sculptor Gustav Lind. Which brings us to the question, who was Gustav Lind? That was the next part of the research that I embarked on after determining that truly he was at the World's Fair, and these planters were there as well. This is his birth certificate. He was born in May of 1856 in Vienna, Austria. This is his death notice. He died on the 22nd of January of 1903. I had a good friend of mine translate that death notice for me so I could have all the details. He was 46 when he died, single, Catholic. He was an artisan of metal, son of a civil servant. He died at his home in Berlin at 2 Blumshof at 11 o'clock in the morning on January 22nd, 1903. On the right, you will see the apartment building in which he died. This photo is circa 1912. On the left, circa 1903, the same year that he died, you can see the street, Blumshof. Blumshof number 15 particularly is being mentioned because this was an area of Berlin in the late 1930s and early 1940s that was used as Jews were being rounded up from other areas of Berlin. They were being concentrated in certain apartments and certain areas. The Forced Homes Project has documented that Blumshof Street was very much involved in that. And in fact, Blumshof numbers 2 through 6 was where the Reich Culture Chamber was located. So within the home that Mr. Gustav Lind died in 1903, 40 years later, the Reich Culture Chamber is there determining what is acceptable and unacceptable art. I also found some newspaper clippings. This one is from Mr. Lind's brother and sister announcing the death of the metal sculptor, their beloved brother. This one appeared the next day from the Association of Berlin Artists, where they referred to Gustav Lind as Mr. Metal Sculptor. Also a mention of where the funeral will be and the date and the time. The day after the funeral, The Lind family put a thank you note in the paper expressing their appreciation for all of the sympathy that had been shown to them. And then there was one more entry. This one came not quite a month later, in which the notice is given that the Gustav Lind workshop has now been sold to Paul Kruger, and that Paul Kruger will now be the owner of the Gustav Lind shop. A question that came to my mind at the time, and then someone asked me about it as well. If Gustav Lind died in January of 1903, how do we know that these items were completed by him? There are two answers to that. The first is that descriptive catalog that was published by the German exhibitors at the time of the World's Fair explicitly mentions by Gustav Lind. And secondarily, we have to keep in mind that originally the World's Fair in St. Louis was due to open in April of 1903. You can see here at their monthly World's Fair bulletin on the left, the May 1902 edition. 1903 is referenced as opening year. The next month's edition, June 1902, 1904 is mentioned. So the German exhibitors, including Gustav Lind, all through 1902, or through most of 1902, half of it at least, they are working under the idea that they need to have everything ready by the fall, certainly, of 1902, so that these things can be shipped across the Atlantic, be unloaded in perhaps New York Harbor, and then be taken by train transport to St. Louis, and then be actually placed properly in the exhibits. So I would suspect that initially they had a you must be finished by date of fall of 1902. They received word, I'm guessing in June or July of 1902, that they now have some more time, but most of them likely had already completed what they were doing. Perhaps Mr. Gustav Lind also was aware that he was sick, although one of the notices mentions a short illness, and he had a great desire to finish it up by the end of 1902. He stamped the date 1904 or '04, a year he didn't live to see, but he was prepared and ready to go, and I'm certain that his good friend Bruno Moring, who was the architect of these two planters, made certain that they were included and they were part of the exhibit as initially planned. Mr. Lind had done a lot of work in and around Berlin during this time period. This is something that he did in 1897, here in 1898, here in 1898, and there you can see is an item that is still actually on exhibit there in Berlin, because it is part of that wonderful building that is the Museum of Communication. Here's from 1898. This one is the one from 1901, in which there was an inauguration for this new statue of Otto von Bismarck. I'm guessing that Mr. Lind is probably there in the crowd somewhere. The next one is in the Sanssouci Park in Potsdam. There was a park created by Frederick the Great in the 1740s. This particular Apollo the Archer was completed by Gustav Lind in 1901, and Kaiser Wilhelm II actually purchased it for placement in this park. Last year, it was taken down and completely restored and then returned to the park as talked about in this article called Dismantling a Naked Hero. Mr. Lind was also mentioned often in Berlin Architecture World. This is something from 1899 that he had completed. The pillars are decorated with reliefs that Lind chased in copper. The next one is from 1899 also. The next one is from 1900, giving more examples of work that Gustav Lind was doing, in addition to the work that would be exhibited at the 1904 World's Fair. Even as late as 1906, when German Arts and Crafts exhibition in Dresden happened, some items were there that had been done by Gustav Lind. And you'll notice again here the architect was Bruno Moring. Here's some other examples of Gustav Lind work, extraordinary. And that one in the middle, of course, The Dancers, it's a bronze work by Gustav Lind. According to the caption, those dancers are quite reminiscent of the dancers that you find on each of the four sides of these planters. So after having studied Gustav Lind, learned a lot more about his life, and seen all these images of the magnificent work that he completed, I really wanted to see him. I searched everywhere on the internet for an image of him so I would know who it is I've been studying and spending so much mental energy on. And finally, I'd been working with several librarians in four different libraries in Germany. And one day I received an email from one of those librarians. I had talked to her about a particular book that I thought might be available there. In fact, it was this book that's for sale for $650 that had some of these images. And I actually called the Klein bookseller and asked, are there any images of Mr. Gustav Lind in your book? And they said no. But then I referenced that book, and it seems there was a second edition of the book in about 1905. And in that edition, there is an image of Mr. Lind, and that librarian took a picture of it with her phone and sent it to me. And then I hired a photographer in Berlin who lived near that particular museum to go there and to take a picture, a really nice, crisp, digitized image of the original of Mr. Lind, and also a digitized image of those two items, which were in this book as well, because this book was published in about 1905, so a year after the World's Fair. And I wanted to have those also in crisp form. So that's an image of Mr. Lind. He was a teacher for about 10 years of the metal arts at the Royal Museum of Applied Arts in Berlin. And then in 1891, he founded his business, which he ran until his death in 1903. These planters were exhibited at the Palace of Varied Industries. I have it circled in black. As you came in the main entrance off Lindell of the World's Fair, about where the Missouri History Museum is today, it would be a building you would quickly see on the right, especially because of two very distinctive towers over the main entrance into the east side of this palace. This map was in that German catalog of about 600 pages. Every area you see grayed out across the fairgrounds, 1,200 acres of fairgrounds, about a dozen palaces. All of those places that you see grayed out are places where there were German exhibits. And the red arrow is pointing specifically to the German exhibit space at the Palace of Varied Industries to the right of the main entrance. This is the main entrance on the left. As you came in the distance, you would be able to see those two towers. Beneath those two towers is the entrance into the Palace of Varied Industries, and the moment you go into that entrance, you are in the German exhibits. Now, the Germans themselves said, this is the largest and best that Germany has ever made at any of these exhibits, and their purpose was to show America what Germany can do now. The president of the World's Fair Corporation, Mr. David Francis, agreed, writing in his 2-volume book about a decade after the fair ended, about a total of 1,200 pages of text. He called the German exhibits at the fair marvelously rich, lavish, massive. They showed the brain of a mighty nation. And on the German exhibits in the Palace of Varied Industries specifically, he said, walking into that palace, walking among those German exhibits was like being in the palace of a king. He called it the most elaborate installation of exhibits that has ever been seen at an exposition or elsewhere. This is the Palace of Varied Industries when it was under construction. This is the palace when it was complete. This is a wonderful image of the palace from the top. You can see the two towers there at the top left part of this photograph. We know this image was taken before the fair started because the courtyard is not complete. You can see a plank sidewalk leading to a building, which actually is a bathroom. There's also an identical bathroom on the other side. It looks like this photograph caught a World's Fair worker on his way back into the building, having come from the bathroom. That entire courtyard space there will be occupied by a German country home and a German garden. And in fact, when the fair opened and when Germany wanted to open its exhibit space, it used that country home there at the Palace of Varied Industries, right off the German Court of Honor. This is the palace at nighttime. This is the palace on opening day. What I want to do now is take you into that main entrance that you see below the two towers. As you walked into that main entrance, you would encounter first, number one, the vestibule. Number two, the large hall that contained about a dozen exhibit cabinets. 2A is the Hall of Honor. It is at the Hall of Honor that the American Eagle and these Gustav Lind planters are displayed. Everything you see there that has a number is a German exhibit. So they occupied much of that east side of this palace. Those numbers 16 through 32, that's in the courtyard. Not the Court of Honor, which is 2A, but in the courtyard itself. And you can still see there the outline of where those two restrooms are on both sides of that courtyard. So if you're standing in the vestibule, number one, about to enter the large hall, this is what you would have seen. The display cabinets on the right and left, a wide walkway leading up to the American Eagle that is perched there at the Court of Honor, which begins at the American Eagle and then extends back to that doorway behind the American Eagle, which leads out to the courtyard. I mentioned Bruno Moring as the architect of this space. There's an image of him. Now, that Prussian eagle at the top behind the American eagle, it looks small in this photograph, but it was actually quite large. As you see here, there are about 20 men standing around that large Prussian eagle that's going to be a highlight in the German Court of Honor. Now, once a person walks behind the eagle, the American eagle, up those few steps into the Court of Honor space itself, this is what it would look like if you turn around before you exit into the courtyard. And that arch window there is the arch window that you see from the outside beneath those two towers. I also want to point out those other two arrows because, in fact, these planters of Gustav Lind could be viewed from both sides. They could be viewed from looking at the eagle. They also could be viewed from looking from behind the eagle. Here's a side view. The planter, the lion's head, the American eagle. You can see the exhibit cabinets on the right. You can see that this space leads to another space of German exhibits. Here's that same image. And you can also notice here that you're, in this picture, able to see both planters, both lion's heads, on both sides of that American eagle. Here's from the other side. And once again, you can see both planters on both sides of the American eagle. And you can also then see the space that you can walk into in order to see the other side. Because keep in mind, these planters had these wrought figures on both sides. Both sides were equally beautiful. The question then becomes, when 1904 ended, when every item in this exhibit space had to be removed, when the exhibit space itself had to be razed to the ground so that Forest Park could become a forest again, or a golf course, which in fact the Palace of Varied Industries was on the Hawthorne golf course. How did these items eventually end up 82 miles south on a farmhouse lawn to be lost and then found again in the 1970s? The first thing to keep in mind, of course, is that every fair was temporary. There was a company, in fact, the Chicago House Wrecking Company, who went around to World's Fairs beginning in 1893 at Chicago, 1899 the Trans-Mississippi, 1901 the Pan American, and the 1904 World's Fair, and they deconstructed and they salvaged everything they could. They created a Sears catalog like means of selling these products. As you can see here, bargain water closets from the World's Fair. You could buy a toilet, a WF 108, a World's Fair 108, or a World's Fair 100. But the Germans had decided that they wanted to be in charge of selling their own exhibits. And they had announced in that descriptive catalog, where I first saw the word jardinière and saw the planters, photographic evidence that they were there at the fair. In that descriptive catalog, they mentioned that they want to sell everything. The American government has modified custom house rules. They had put this process into the hands of Mr. Ferdinand Wiederhold, and that anyone could speak to him at any time at the Varied Industries building. So at some point, someone had a conversation with Mr. Wiederhold, maybe in front of these planters. They agreed upon a price. They agreed upon a pickup date. It is possible that that record is in an archive in Germany. But as far as we know now, we do not know who initially purchased these two planters at the end of the World's Fair in December 1904. We do know that Mr. Ferdinand Wiederhold was very successful. In fact, so successful that he had some excess funds with which to purchase a share of the J.H. Crane Furniture Company in St. Louis. And that announcement was made in the German language St. Louis newspaper and the English language St. Louis newspaper, with reference to the fact that he had sold the German section in the Varied Industries building. When I started thinking about how did these two items end up 82 miles south of the fairgrounds, I decided that I would begin by looking at plats. I started researching the ownership of the plats to determine who was living there in the bend of the St. Francis River in 1904. The Turpins and the McLarens. The McLarens moved there shortly after the World's Fair. The Turpins lived there at the time of the World's Fair. But investigating these two families, I did not find any evidence that they would have purchased these items. And it would seem to me if you purchased a brand new item from the St. Louis World's Fair and then a few years later you left that location, you would take those items with you. You wouldn't leave them behind the way they were left behind in 1973 when the Jennings family purchased the home. Eventually, I settled on the King family as the family that brought these items to that location. That plat is from 1972. Kay King died in 1972. All of her property was purchased by the Jennings family in March of 1973. In looking at the King family, it seems clear to me that William J. King, the man whose childhood image is circled in red, he purchased this property in 1941. And it seems quite clear to me that he is the one responsible for bringing these two items to that property. His grandfather, William King, was an Irish immigrant, a police officer. His father, James King, also a police officer in St. Louis. In fact, he was shot and killed in 1920. William King has a brother, Joe, a brother, James, a sister, Helen, a brother, Francis, who was accidentally killed in a gunshot accident in 1909 in the family home, in the bedroom where he and William were playing cowboys and Indians. And one of the revolvers from their grandfather, the boys got hold of it, and William King accidentally shot and killed his brother. This image on the left was taken at this property in Farmington, south of Farmington. This is one of the items left behind at the home when it was sold to the Jennings family in 1973. That photo on the right was actually shared at Ancestry in 2010 with this caption, "Photo of the William King home in Farmington." You will notice in that photograph, probably late 1940s, maybe early 1950s, they have a Lassie-like dog right there on the front lawn, statuary, planters everywhere, at least a dozen, a beautifully manicured home looking west at the St. Francis Mountains, part of the Ozark Plateau. In the photo on the left, you have Mr. King, Mrs. King, and at the bottom, Mr. King and someone, perhaps a brother, someone who's helping maybe with the sidewalk out front. You can see also this same dog in the other image is in the top image. You can see some of the statuary on the left of the top image. Now, all of that statuary and these items, what you see on this lawn, also conveyed to the Jennings family. Here's a photograph in the 1990s after the Jennings family had really fixed up the property inside and out, added a rock facing to the home, and these two statues are still there, and you also can see a lot of the planters. This is the property upon which these two planters were found. Also found at this property was this certificate in the name of James M. King, who is the father of William King, who purchased that property in 1941. He had at least one share in the World's Fair Exposition Company. And also left behind at the property were rumors that these two planters came from a fancy hotel in St. Louis. The story was that the King family owned a fancy hotel in St. Louis, and that is where these two planters originated. When I dug a little more deeply into the King family, I found the three World War II draft registration cards for James, William, and Joe King. You will notice that Joe King is employed at the Mayfair Hotel. James King is employed at the Lenox Hotel. William King is employed in his own business, which was a bar, King's Bar, about a block from the Mayfair and a block from the Lenox. And he mentions or lists the Mayfair Hotel as the permanent address of his brother Joe King. So the story that there was some involvement in a hotel is true. No one could remember the name of the hotel. There were also other items from these hotels at the home, but they were sold in the auction after Mr. Jennings died. No one could recall the names of these hotels, but it seems clear here that the Lenox and the Mayfair would be the two hotels that the King family is very much involved in as employees. The Mayfair Hotel opened in 1925 in St. Louis. It was owned by Charles Heiss, who was a German immigrant. It was from the Mayfair, in fact, that KMOX in December 1925 first broadcast over the airwaves. KMOX broadcast from that hotel and sometimes from the Lenox Hotel for several years into the early 1930s. The Lenox Hotel was opened in 1929. It also was owned by Charles Heiss. And an interesting clue comes from this particular article in Post-Dispatch that the Heiss Hotel system in 1929 had not only the Mayfair and the Lenox, but a new hotel to me, I had not heard of it, called the Kingsway. When I searched for the Kingsway Hotel that's now in the hands of Charles Heiss, I learned that the Kingsway Hotel was built for the 1904 World's Fair. It was called the Buckingham originally. Memberships were sold so that anyone from anywhere in the country could come and stay there during the fair. It was ideally located, as their brochure at the bottom left shows, on Lindell Boulevard from the club to the fairgrounds, because this hotel was between Lindell and West Pine on Kings Highway, where the 100, the new building, is now in the Central West End. In terms of Mr. Charles Heiss, he now owns this building. It's possible, I suppose, that the owner of the building in 1904 purchased these two planters from the Palace of Varied Industries. Maybe they were at this hotel all the way until 1929, when Mr. Heiss is now owner of the hotel. Maybe Mr. Heiss brought them to the Mayfair, brought them to the Lenox at that time, or when he sold this hotel. Mr. Heiss, a German immigrant, would have been interested in German exhibits at the World's Fair. He came to the United States when he was in his 20s. He arrived in St. Louis in 1915, and he came there to manage the construction of and then to manage the Hotel Statler. The Hotel Statler opened in St. Louis in 1917. It was part of the E.M. Statler chain. And Mr. Statler there, pictured on the right, had built a temporary hotel in Buffalo, 2,100 rooms, for the Pan American Exposition. And he had been asked to do the same at the St. Louis World's Fair. He built the Inside Inn, the only hotel on the fairgrounds. Maybe Mr. Statler bought these two planters. And maybe they were in the Statler Hotel. And maybe that's where Charles Heiss first seen them. And maybe then Charles Heiss acquired them, and when he constructed the Mayfair and the Lenox a decade later, he brought them to the Mayfair or the Lenox. This is what the Inside Inn looked like on the grounds of the St. Louis World's Fair. So there are lots of threads here that lead to fancy St. Louis hotels, which was the rumor, the story, that these two planters had come from a fancy city hotel. Maybe from the Inside Inn, maybe from the Buckingham, maybe from the Statler, maybe from the Lenox. I think they came from the Mayfair. And here's why. William King, the man who bought the property in 1941, died on the property in 1957. The man whose widow lived there until 1972. The property was then sold in 1973 to the Jennings family. William King's brother, Joe, was married to Julia King. Julia King is William King's sister-in-law, and she worked for Charles Heiss since she was a 15-year-old girl in 1927, and she continued working there into the 1970s. She becomes the manager of the Hotel Mayfair. She eventually manages the Mayfair and the Lenox together. So William King is living south of Farmington. There are statuary that look like items that would have been at the World's Fair for sale or exhibit. The planters are there at the property. His brother is the transportation manager for the Hotel Mayfair and the Hotel Lenox. His sister-in-law is the manager of the hotel. These hotels are owned by Charles Heiss, who once owned the hotel, the Kingsway, that was built for the World's Fair as the Buckingham. Charles Heiss had worked for Mr. Statler. He came to St. Louis to work at the Hotel Statler. My view is that these two planters were at the Hotel Mayfair, and at some point when decor was changed, they were purchased by William King along with other items. Likely his brother, the transportation manager, brought them south to to Farmington. They were placed on the property at some point in the 1940s, and that's where they remained for 30 years until Mr. and Mrs. Jennings rescued them and then had them restored in 1981. And I think this is particularly poignant if that's the case, because when Mr. Jennings and the workmans took those two planters up to America's Center, when Antiques Roadshow was in town, they were bringing those two items within a block of the Lenox Hotel and the Statler Hotel. Both hotels, as you can see, with planters outside, even today. So possibly bringing them very near to home. Even the Mayfair Hotel is just 2 blocks from America's Center. These 3 buildings still stand. They've changed hands many times. Notice again planters outside. I would say it's likely, it's probable that these planters found their way to the Mayfair Hotel in the 20s, remained there in the 30s, were sold to William King in the 1940s. William King died in 1957 at his property south of Farmington. He's buried at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. His wife lived another 15 years at the same property, RFD number 1 in Farmington. She died in August 1972. Her home was sold to the Jennings family in March 1973. Most of the King family is also buried at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. And in thinking about this, I then wanted to also know, where is Mr. Lind buried? And what kind of amazing monument might the Berlin Association of Artists put up to mark the gravesite of Mr. Metal Sculptor Gustav Lind? I contacted the cemetery after spending a lot of time with this 1907 Berlin map to figure out precisely where the cemetery was. I contacted the current management at the cemetery, which is beautiful, and they were very helpful. They answered every question that I had, and they sent me a couple of documents, including this one, which references Gustav Lind and his burial January 25th of 1903. And this added a piece of information that had not been known before, was not listed on the death notice or the death certificate. He had died of chronic inflammation of the kidney, which we know can be attributed to overexposure to copper and other metals over long periods of time. I had hoped to see a grave marker, but I learned that this cemetery is a period of repose cemetery. You rent your space for 20 years, then it can be renewed by family in some cases, in other cases it cannot. So highly likely 6 other people have shared the gravesite of Gustav Lind since he was buried there in 1903. Whatever marker might have been placed there was either cast aside or maybe reclaimed by family or friends. It could still exist somewhere. In July of 2025, to honor Gustav Lind, to spend time with these 2 planters that he created for the World's Fair, I invited to the Mineral Area College campus the current owners of both planters, Mr. and Mrs. Fritchie, who are photographed there on the far right. I also invited the 2 men, Stan Winkler and Lloyd Irvin, who did the restoration in 1981. They are pictured there on the middle. I invited the workmans who had owned the planter that has the white liner, and there on the left. Also, you'll see 2 of my colleagues at the college, Colton Atkinson and Dr. Zaromsky, on either side of me. And then on the far left is Gary Bunting, who's a World Fair collector and good friends with the restorers. I presented to them the initial research as it existed then. It has since expanded quite significantly. So Mr. Lind and his planters, we now know, were at the St. Louis World's Fair. We have written and photographic evidence that makes it clear. I was also curious about some of these other items that were at the World's Fair, including the lion's heads that Mr. Gustav Lind had completed for the fair. That magnificent American eagle that stood on guard at the Court of Honor has been in Philadelphia for about 100+ years. Mr. John Wanamaker, who also purchased the organ that was at Festival Hall and lots of other items from the World's Fair, purchased that eagle, took it to Philadelphia. It was in his shopping mall, which later became a Macy's. It's now been vacant for about 1 year. But the story goes that that would be a location where parents would say to children when they were at the mall, "You meet us back at that eagle in 1 hour. Meet me at the eagle," it was called. It also had a bit of a cameo in a really weird 1987 movie called Mannequin. You can see the eagle there on the bottom. That's a screen capture from the film. And at the top, you can see a bit of the Wanamaker organ that had been at the 1904 World's Fair. The lion's head, at least one of them, still exists. This is a home in Germany. It was a home that was designed by the architect, Bruno Moring. So it seems clear that at least one of these lion's heads, he returned to Germany at the end of the fair. It was placed at this home, and it is still there at this home. In terms of the statuary that was in the lawn when the Kings owned it, and then also when the Jennings family owned it, that was sold as part of the estate sale in 2022. These two photos were taken the day of the estate sale by Renee Razor. She, in fact, purchased both of these items. I happened to have someone at the home doing a little bit of work for me. I learned that he lived in the area. I asked him about the Jennings family. He didn't know the name, but he remembered going to the auction, and he remembered that his friend had purchased these statues at the auction. She and I then had communication, and she sent the photos to me. At some point, Mr. Jennings asked one of his grandsons to repaint these, and the grandson took some liberty, and instead of painting them white as they always had been, he gave them a flesh tone and a little bit of color. I'm sure everybody at the World's Fair Society has been to the Missouri History Museum's new exhibit on the World's Fair, but I always like to mention it at the end of this talk. I even got my mother to come up there to see Judy Garland's red dress from Meet Me in St. Louis. This is an exquisite exhibit. I particularly love the model of the World's Fair grounds because it helps you place where things actually were. The red arrow at the top is pointing to the German house. That was the official German building at the World's Fair. And then the other red arrow is pointing to those two towers under which one would enter and immediately in the distance find that eagle and then Mr. Lind's two planters. 20 million people visited the fair. With this building being something that would draw a person as they came in the main entrance, I would estimate that millions of people in 1904 actually saw these two jardinières. I love when you're at this exhibit and the current day space comes down to show you where everything now would have been in 1904. And once again, that particular space in the Palace of Varied Industries is now where the Hawthorne holes number 5 and holes number 7 are. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak to the 1904 World's Fair Society. Thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you, Mike, for organizing, and thank you for allowing me to present this research and to sort of, in my mind, grab Gustav Lind from the past and bring him back into the present. Thank you very much.